Hola, hola. Hola. Buenas noches. Muchas gracias a todos y a todas por venir. Un poquitos ahora. Fin de semestre e invierno requiere mayor compromiso para las actividades extracurriculares. Hoy tenemos la última actividad pública del CEAC este semestre, del Centro de Estudios de Arquitectura Contemporánea. Nos visita Shantel Blakely, que está acá en Buenos Aires terminando una investigación para su próximo libro. Antes de presentarla a Shantel, les quiero contar un poco otras de las actividades del CEAC. Por un lado, invitarlos a Foodscapes, a esta exhibición que está abierta a todo el público en el taller de arquitectura. El taller de arquitectura está en el segundo piso del edificio del Corta. Foodscapes es una itinerancia de lo que fue el pabellón español en la Bienal de Venecia del año pasado, un pabellón curado por Eduardo Castillo Vinuesa y Manuel Ocaña. Es una exhibición que trabaja, como su nombre lo indica, sobre los paisajes que se construyen en torno a la comida, en torno al consumo, la distribución, la producción, la digestión de alimentos. La exhibición va a estar abierta 2 meses y realmente los invito a todos que si tienen tiempo y les interesa que la vean. Primero porque para nosotros es siempre una hazaña poder llevar adelante estas exhibiciones en el taller. Y después porque tiene una variedad de materiales y documentos fascinantes. Es una muestra con piezas audiovisuales hechas a medida, más o menos duran 1 hora, es una serie de videos que les recomiendo que los vean. Hay algunas piezas editoriales para ver, y que va a estar abierta hasta el 1 de agosto, creo. Así que vacaciones de invierno para verla. Está abierta de lunes a viernes y a diferencia de estas actividades del CEAC, que uno tiene que anotarse, inscribirse en la página de internet, la exhibición es abierta, simplemente con presentarse en planta baja y hacer que viene a la exhibición, pueden entrar, pueden recomendarla a cualquier persona que venga, no es tan complicado. Como les contaba, esta es la última actividad del semestre con Shantel Blakely. La actividad siguiente con Caramos Cubo en agosto desafortunadamente se suspendió. Era la primera actividad del próximo semestre por un problema de salud de Janet Cubo. Ya estamos trabajando en un reemplazo y en la programación del CEAC para el próximo semestre, que estará disponible online en las próximas semanas. Este póster, como siempre, si quieren, se pueden llevar una copia. Como siempre, llamamos a diseñadores gráficos distintos cada semestre que hagan una pieza. Esta del otro lado tiene esta grilla para dibujar metalizada, así que se pueden llevar un par y dibujar sobre esa hoja si tengan ganas. Bueno, now switching to English to welcome Shantel. We are really excited to have her here at the school. We met with Shantel several years ago, but just online when I was an editor at Plot. And Shantel met Florencia, I think it was at the GSD, and she was developing her research on the Olivetti building by Zanuso, and we did a first publication of that article at Plot. It was 2015, okay, quite a while ago. So I'd like to introduce her formally. Shantel Blakely holds a master's degree from Princeton University, a PhD in History and Theory of Architecture from Columbia University, and an MA in Philosophy, right? She has taught courses of architectural theory in different schools, such as Columbia, Barnard College, Parsons, and she's currently has a teaching position at Rice. Alongside her teaching, she also managed the public lecture and conference program at Harvard GSD during a couple of years, where she worked with a lot of dear friends of the school, such as Enrique Walker. And as an independent critic and scholar, she has worked on the relationship between architecture and design with the ideologies of experiential practice. Her writings have appeared in Plot when we worked together, in Blog magazine, in AA Files, and in Avery Review. She has also participated in various exhibitions and symposia as essayist, speaker, and advisor. She has 2 forthcoming books, I think, or one, no, one, okay. One, it's Apartamento Preto, at Home with Marco Zanuso, with MIT Press, which characterizes the architect's stance on the human potential of mechanization and industrial designs and buildings in family homes and factories in Italy and overseas. And the Charles Fleming book is not...
It's in development. It's not forthcoming.
Okay, it's not forthcoming, but she did a research on Charles Fleming, a Black architect, in the 1960s. This research was supported by the Getty Research Institute and with the Graham Foundation. I've been with Shantel this past week, visiting this building and touring around, and it's really nice to be with a detailed historian who has a very precise view of history from our present time, not just history for the sake of history, but trying to learn about these buildings and the ethical and aesthetic stances designers had at that time, and what can we bring to today. So please join me welcoming Shantel.
Can you hear me, everybody?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Javier, for that wonderful long introduction. And it's amazing to be here. I had a chance to see this building yesterday that I have been studying for quite a long time. I think I gave my first presentation on it at the Society of Architectural Historians in 2011, so that means it's 13 years, but I have been doing other things. But I feel as though it's been a very difficult project to understand and to try to sort of dig into, because in some sense nothing seems to be hidden or secret about it. So I hope that this will be both informative in terms of giving you a glimpse of the building as it was, because as it is today, you can't see very much of it. I learned about it through archives and only saw it in person 2 days ago. So even I'm still starting to understand it. But it's an important work of architecture, and it's kind of, I hope it will become appreciated as sort of one of the sort of treasures in this area eventually. Right. The problem that I'm trying to take on in this talk is, how do we read this building critically? Not just to say, oh, it's brilliant and problem solved, but to see what issues it puts on the table and how it manifests architecture in a particular way that belongs to sort of Marco Zanuso's approach to architecture and what he wanted from architecture, what he wanted architecture to do for society. So part of the challenge for me of this talk is that it's trying to be both a history talk that will sort of describe the building and give a little bit of its background, and a theory talk that introduces a concept that I hope will help us to kind of dig into the building a little bit. And that concept is automatisms. And I'm sorry, it's such a it's a hard word to keep in focus. I even kept making typos when I tried to type it. Automatism is, in a sense, a way of being automatic. And what I'm interested in, generally speaking, is Zanuso's attitude toward default or automatic or automated processes in the production of the building. And so I'll say a bit more about that as we go. Just to give an overview of how I've organized the talk, I'll start by talking about Olivetti, the company, just very briefly, that really would merit a whole talk or series of talks in itself. Such a rich history there. And how they came to build a factory in Argentina. And Zanuso, then the architect, what was his formation, what were his interests and his experience that he brought to the project, his work in Milan that gives us some sense of the range of his interests and talents, the factories he had built in Italy already. And then I'll talk about the factory here, the Buenos Aires factory for Olivetti, and the reception, so how the building was received by critics, what people said about it. And it really has not been very much discussed in the architecture literature, so it's just very brief. And then I sort of try to delve into what I'm calling, my interpretation of the building. So first, an introduction. This is what the building looks like today. So it's on Avenida Rivadavia at kilometer 33. So essentially you just drive out the road and there's a train track, a railroad line that runs parallel to the road. And so you see it kind of flash by in your car window. Maybe the best way to see it might be from the train, actually. So the first thing you see is the site marker, this, which is a billboard. And today it just looks like a billboard, but that's actually the corner of the site. Then you come, as you go down the road, you see looking this way, you see the gate. And the gatehouse is this pavilion here, and then you just see this little rippling building. So it's a single-story building, a mat building, you might say. And then as you go farther down the road, it looks sort of like this. You just see the end. And this is the beam. It's a very important detail that I'll talk about later. So it's not much as seen from the road. Here is the aerial view. It's pretty extensive building. That's the billboard, the entrance. And so we were able to go down the streets and then also along the back to see the back. This whole side of the campus is inaccessible because the roads don't go there. But then one of my teachers was from here. Javier kindly drove me out there and we were able to see this. But this is what it looks like in the back. You can start to see a little bit of the former architecture here. It is now a cigarette factory, which is kind of fitting, I think, because the beams are these hollow tubes. And this canopy is part of the original design. So this employee's entrance with the bike shed next to it. And these are what we saw before. Just another diagram. And this is the picture of the sign. We found it on the front. You see it's been made into a cigarette advertisement on the back. The billboard is peeled away. You can see the Olivetti logo there again. So I'll come back to that point. So what was Olivetti? We're talking about a company, it was sort of singular, a singularity in Italy. The founder of the company, Camillo Olivetti, was born in the 1800s and established the company in 1908 after attending the Turin Polytechnic and traveling. He came to the US, to Stanford, to study electrical engineering. He had trained as an engineer. He was also an ardent socialist, so even in establishing his company, he was at the same time meeting with people in the city and working through labor issues. The sort of association with a typewriter that they would produce with literacy and sort of the empowerment of individuals was a theme that would run through the entire history of the company. In 1901, his son Adriano Olivetti was born. He would take over the company in the 1930s. Camillo Olivetti was Jewish. He was from a family that had been in that area since the 17th century, I believe. And his wife was Waldensian, so a small Protestant sect. So they had a very strong religious foundation that they gave to Adriano Olivetti, who eventually became Catholic. He had a very, very illustrious career. If you read Italian, there's a new biography out about him. There's been like reams and reams of literature written about this family, and especially these two. They were intellectuals and engineers and deeply committed to sort of human progress. When Adriano Olivetti took over the company, he, after having toured the US and seen the sort of state of factories, and he studied Taylorism and tried to sort of come to terms with the sort of how the society of the factory could work. He, at the same time, was innovative in creating a publicity department, which included painters trained at the Bauhaus, poets, as well as engineers and technicians who worked together. Architects also, the architects Fugini and Bellini were part of the publicity department founded by Adriano Olivetti in the 30s. And they produced exhibitions and advertisements and literature and events around the production of typewriters. I'm showing these two typewriters, the Lexicon on the top left, and then the Lectura 22 on the bottom left. Those were, well, the Lectura 22 was a portable typewriter that first produced in 1948 and 1950 respectively. So they would, World War II caused this kind of interruption in their activities, but so when they resumed, these models were just coming out and they received the full sort of suite of Olivetti publicity. In fact, the company became so well known for its trademark, as it was called at the time, that the Museum of Modern Art in New York organized an exhibition curated by Leo Leoni, Italian emigre to the US, on Olivetti. So here you have a company being the subject of an art museum exhibition. This is the sort of status that Olivetti had. So Adriano Olivetti had asked himself in the 1930s whether industry could have a vocation. To quote him, "Can industry give itself ends? Are they to be found only in the index of profit? Or is there not, within the apparent rhythm, something more enchanting, an ideal substance, a destination, a vocation, even in the life of the factory?" And he undertook a number of projects at the same time that he grew the company in the 1950s. He started a publishing house, Edizioni di Comunità, and the name Comunità corresponds to community, he was a political theorist. He trained like his father at the Turin Polytechnic, but he also wrote political theory. So he wrote an essay called The Political Order of the Community. So the community was his model for society. It was a kind of industrial society. And to communicate about his ideas, he published a journal, Comunità, and he also established this publishing house, Edizioni di Comunità, that published his books, but also translations of other writers. So the latest in sociology among British writers and German writers, and all the literature he thought needed to be known for people to appreciate his theories. The picture in the center bottom there, it gives you a sense of what things were like in Ivrea around, let's say, 1955. Italy, you may know, went through industrialization relatively late. So in 1945, it was still switching from agrarian to industrial society. And so even as Olivetti, in its headquarters around Ivrea, this small town in Piedmont, was constructing modernist housing, like, oops, what did I do? Like you see here in here in the background. And even while people were driving Vespas, these new, motorcycle products that were, becoming popular, there was still farming going on. And so you had mule-drawn carts. And so the question he was dealing with was how it's in a sense what we might call today like sustainable growth or development, a way to support these different levels of ways of life. So I just say that it's really, there's much more to the story there. But this is who we were dealing with. Adriano Olivetti, you see in the upper right, in the 1950s, he's sort of older man at that point, still active in all these different areas. And he at one point ran for a seat in government. Unfortunately, he died in 1960, quite young. He was just under 60 years of age at the time. And with his death, a lot of the momentum, things were not quite exactly the same. There was a certain momentum and the company kept going for quite some years after that. But the major period of interest relative to the Argentina factory is sort of between 1949 and 1960. So a part of what's interesting about Ivrea, the headquarters of Olivetti in Italy, is that the ideas of Adriano Olivetti eventually started to inform this sort of part of the city where the factory was. So the original building for the Olivetti factory, established purchased or acquired by Camillo Olivetti in 1896, was a building built in 1896. The company was established in 1908. That you see there, marked on the map there. This is Via Gervis, which was the sort of street coming from the center of Ivrea and the train station where the train went to Turin, where the factory complex would begin to grow. So between, let's say 1950 or between 1939 and 1962, Adriano Olivetti would direct a series of extensions to the factory. So they building more buildings. These were designed and built by Figini and Pollini, two Milanese architects or architects practicing in Milan, associated with modern architecture. But another part of Adriano Olivetti's thinking was that there should be buildings that weren't about production, but they were about they had social purposes. So the Mensa or cafeteria, designed by Ignazio Gardella, actually a Piedmontese architect associated though with the sort of modernism who's centered in Milan. He was a fan of Frank Lloyd Wright, and so his buildings at this period had this like 120-degree angle, and also developed a sort of close relationship with nature. So this was a social space where workers could eat their meals and connect and informally. In addition, there was a social services building. Also, this one was by Figini and Pollini as well. Here, so across the street from the factory, and here there were sort of like healthcare, health insurance. There was a night school. There were sort of offices to help people if they needed money and a loan or something like that. So it was a kind of service center. And there was also childcare. Figini and Pollini, the same architects, designed a daycare center. So not far, I think it's somewhere in this vicinity, also not far from the factory. So the factory was, the model of the Olivetti factory was modeled or reflected Adriano Olivetti's ideas about community and provided this sort of diverse set of services. And that's important because to some extent, well, at least the brief for the Olivetti factory here in Buenos Aires would be to recapitulate that condition of support services. So Olivetti had a presence in Argentina from the 1920s. Initially, there was a branch office in Rosario and agents across the country. and these were importers of the company's typewriters. In 1932, this new company, Olivetti Argentina, was established. This was a period in which the company was establishing footholds in different places. So Barcelona, in the middle of the 40s, received their own kind of Olivetti headquarters factory. Great Britain, there would be one in England, one in the US, and so forth. And by 1951, the idea was that machines wouldn't just be imported to Argentina, they would actually be produced here. And so an office was established in Buenos Aires, and they acquired a building at Ramos Mejia, which is still there, according to Google Maps. A single large factory building. This actually picture doesn't show the whole of it. It kind of extends down back in the block. And that would remain actually a place of production for many years, I think into the 1970s, even as the new factory began to be constructed. Are there any questions so far?
No.
Okay, no, okay. Stop me, feel free to stop me if you have questions. So by the early 50s, we're talking about this company with sort of distributors across Argentina and beginning to produce. But it turned out that the level of production was going to be expanded. So it was decided to start producing more, even to produce typewriters that might be shipped outside of Argentina and start to provide other countries in South America. And at the same time, Olivetti also began initiating construction on a factory in Brazil. It was built at Sao Paulo. It's now Guarulhos shopping center, and much altered, but it is still there as well. So the architect who was brought in to work on these factories, both the one in Brazil and the one in Argentina, was Marco Zanuso. And at some point, Zanuso had been part of the sort of Olivetti circle since 1949, when Adriano Olivetti had reached out to form a kind of advisory committee with about 100 architects and artists and business people, mostly in Milan, that had some kind of meetings in Ivrea and helped shape company sort of agenda and objectives. But he was hired to do the factories around 1953 or 1954. According to my research, he was first hired to do the Argentina factory, and then the Brazil one came sort of went into production somewhat later. So who was Zanuso? He was born in 1916 and educated at Milan Polytechnic, which is Milan's one official architecture school. He served in the Italian naval forces before commencing his practice. He actually graduated in 1939, like right the day before he had to go out as a soldier or as a sailor. This is what the faculty at the Milan Polytechnic at the time included Gaetano Moretti, Italian architect, who, however, designed the Senate Palace in Montevideo, or at least maybe it was a renovation, I'm not sure exactly, but this is the style that was being taught at the Milan Polytechnic at that time. It's a kind of neoclassicism. Even though some of the faculty, like Piero Portaluppi and other of Zanuso's professors, were designing in the more sort of European modern sort of vernacular. So he had this sort of traditional education in architecture, I suppose is the point there. At the same time, they were aware in Milan of like European modernism. Architects in offices practiced in a modern way, and the students went to offices and hung out there and worked there and learned to they were committed modernists. I don't know of anyone who graduated from Milan Polytechnic and started designing like this after World War II, even though people like Moretti and Portaluppi were still teaching neoclassicism into the 1950s at that school. Early on, Zanuso professed an interest in industrial design, so designing things. So he was one of a group that was featured actually in an article in Vogue magazine. Here he is, and here's Anna Castelli Ferrieri, noted woman, architect and designer. This was just an article that profiled Milan architects and their interest in industrial design. And you see here actually this chair, Zanuso designed it for a competition at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. He never went to New York. He didn't go to New York at that point. He sent his competition entry in. It was made of iron with a fabric seat, which gives you a sense of, the seat was repurposed tents, canvas from tents, army tents. So it's such a contrast with America with its shiny steel and fiberglass. He didn't win, but he did get a sort of honorable mention. This is his apartment. My other project on Zanuso right now is a book that looks at how he handled things like this Chiavari chair from the 1700s next to his own modern chair. But that's a whole other story. The lady chair here went into production in 1947 as the first mass-produced chair in Italy. This is what Zanuso is known for. Eventually, he would also design television, sewing machine, numerous other things. There he is around 1960 in his office. So that's to say he was an industrial designer. At the same time, he was doing buildings. This is his office building on Via Seneto in Milan. You can kind of see the neoclassical influence with these kind of window panels, but you look close, the decorations, these were actually done by the artist Lucio Fontana. It's a kind of ceramic panel with the kind of scraping and stain applied to it. This is a pink granite. So it's sort of traditional but new, this mixture. And there was also a mural behind this glass here also by Fontana, these panels below the windows there. Via Seneto, Milan, because of its burgeoning industry of making things, furniture, appliances, and so forth, it had an annual fair called the Fiera Campionaria that was a kind of scene of spectacles. This is sort of, Zanuso actually designed the Via Seneto building with Roberto Menchi, another architect who designed this swimming pool, which is quite often photographed, part of the Fiera. So design was this kind of spectacle that was starting to shape Milan, actually, in ways that people are ambivalent about. Not only Zanuso, but also his structural engineer that he worked with on the Argentina building, an art engineer named Luigi Antonietti, were part of this sort of fair culture. This is one of Antonietti's works. It's a pavilion it's a cast concrete pavilion that was built in the Parco Sempione next to the Triennale, the Palazzo delle Arte in Milan, where they had every 3 years a big exhibition of architecture and art. So you can see that Antonietti, there's certain creativity here as well. He did this with 2 architects. This sort of ingenious folded roof design sitting on these wedge-shaped feet, rebar, and so forth. So Zanuso participated in the spectacle culture. In one way was he designed showrooms, like this particular one, a showroom for Arte Luce, a lamp company. And this was a collaboration with Albus Steiner, a really interesting figure in Milan, and a graphic designer, sort of display designer, exhibition designer. Okay, but probably what was almost certainly important to Adriano Olivetti is, as far as Zanuso's qualifications, included his factories. So he had done, by, say, 1953, a few factories, including this one for SEMA, shown on the left here with these sort of relatively familiar section for a factory. This is a photograph of a negative of a drawing. It's very like meta, but in reversed. But you can see it has this kind of these sloped roof panels and letting light down. So he had mastered this idea of this sort of single-story factory pavilion. And this was, I think, quite a much more important project relative to this factory in Buenos Aires, the factory for a company called Shadis, which was a ceramics company in Palermo, Sicily. So when Zanuso came to Buenos Aires, the Buenos Aires Herald featured an announcement where he had come here. Business, it's like a list of arrivals. Architect for the new factories of Olivetti Argentina to be constructed in Merlo has arrived in Buenos Aires from Milan, Italy. And here he is shown in a stage of that trip, that first trip in 1955, where he visited not just Argentina, but also Brazil and Uruguay. Bless you. He brought along his Rolleiflex, which you might have seen in an earlier photo. Clearly, he went to Brasilia. Not much is known. I guess I could pause here and say that this research has grown out of my dissertation on Marco Zanuso, which began with me being sort of shown into his archive and thinking, oh, an archive, that means I can make a dissertation. But you never know what you're going to get in an archive. Sometimes you get journals and doc calendars, and you can sort of work with those to create a narrative. In this case, it was much more fragments and questions, because unlike some of the architects that he worked closely with in Milan's architecture culture, like Ernesto Nathan Rogers, who was director of Domus, director of Casabella, Zanuso was not a big writer of theory. He did write some theory, which I will talk about, but he tended to be much more pragmatic in his writing. And so things like this are just intriguing and suggestive, but we don't know exactly, let's say, who these people are who were with him and so forth. So back to the Olivetti factory here in Buenos Aires. It's sort of devilishly difficult to photograph, and it clearly has posed challenges to photographers down the ages. But you can see here it had the gatehouse that I photographed looked originally like this. I think the lettering changed at certain points. But from the air, it presents itself as, again, a one-story math building. And from the sidewalk, it had these sort of cantilevered, you see, it's made of beams, it's on columns. The beams are cantilevered out. So you have this whole roof structure that is cantilevered out over the sidewalk next to it. And that is happening on the ends of this cross axis there. So the entrance here would be out here relative to that photo. And then this view that you can see from the street today is this part of the building down here. The lexicon, which we've seen before. So there were two stages of the design for this building. The first one looked like this, and already you can see it's single story. It has it's very similar to the way it looks now. Let's look at the plan. First, it's a grid, and you see the columns on the grid here. Interestingly, in this drawing, there you can see that like a grid has been drawn on the site that extends beyond the building, and then the building is kind of plotted within it. So it's unequal. It's longer along the transverse axis, the space between columns, and the shorter space on the longitudinal axis. But so there, it's plotted out. And what these dotted lines here indicate, those ones, not the arrows, but the lines, is a space where the factory could expand. So one of the issues with the Ramos Mejia building was that it was its size, so it had a sort of maximum capacity for putting in manufacturing machines and people, which meant that you could only you'd reach a ceiling where you couldn't make any more factory typewriters per month, right? So, but demand coming from Argentina, coming from across South America, was variable. So the idea was to build a factory that could be expanded. So if they needed more production, they could just build more factory, right? So that's the principle here. But what happened here that didn't work so well, so Zanuso figured out that they could use this grid and convincingly shows that you could make the building bigger. Something inconvenient though is that this building would move to here. And what this building is actually a giant fan. So it was meant to be a giant air handling unit. And this was a duct that would run the length of the building to bring air conditioning or heating into the building. So the problem here, you can see how you would have reached, again, a kind of ceiling where you couldn't make the fan any bigger, where this system wouldn't work after a certain point. At least that's my theory about why this was not the best solution and not the solution they did ultimately. And also tearing this down and rebuilding it, maybe you'd have even more stages in between. It looks plausible, but I'm not sure anyone would have wanted to do that. So this here on the right is something more like what was built. It's actually not what was actually built, but it's a late drawing. It's the latest one that I had access to. These are both from the Zanuso archive in Switzerland. It's sort of affiliated with Mendrisio Accademia dell'Architettura. It's called the Archivio del Moderno, and they have several architect archives there and critic archives. So I tried to mark the Avenida Riva de Villa because these the orientation is different, but you can see the general layout is the same. The entrance is more or less the same place, but it's lost this sort of head building that was out here. This went away, and that was sort of definitive of the second version. Again, you have slightly different angles here, there. But so you see the second version now has those columns we saw in the photographs that cantilever out. This one had a slightly different design. And where this building would have been, it's not, there isn't there. There is a thermoelectric center, which would remain. So just as in Ivrea, there were productive spaces and social spaces to be kind of, to put it in the most simple way, in a way, schematic way. There were these social spaces that are around the productive spaces. You had you had your factory with its dressing rooms, lockers, and administrative offices, and then you had support spaces and sort of humane, educational, and human resource spaces. Similarly, in the Buenos Aires factory, there was a wing that had the cafeteria, it had a library, and there were classrooms among the offices along with the productive space. Image of the cafeteria, not quite as fancy as at Ivrea, but there it was. And on the other hand, the production space. So this was a rational design. If you're familiar with sort of Italian rationalism, the sort of Italian version of modern architecture, grids, right angles were kind of its signature. And this is a rational solution in which this grid area is used as a space where the machines, the production will be laid out. So Zanuso worked closely with technicians at Olivetti to understand each machine, its size, its dimensions, the clearance it would need around it in order to establish the dimensions of this space for production. But just as the company in general had this kind of policy of commissioning artworks and cultivating a cultured sort of atmosphere in their shops and their factories, this was no different. And work was commissioned from sculptor Andrea Cascella. It is 3 meters high and 20 meters long, made out of carved limestone jointed together. Cascella was really fascinated by joints, and he loved working with stone and the shadows made that would fall on stone and so forth. So, and obviously this is not a very easily movable artwork, but I think it is actually still there and still sort of exposed to view in the entrance hall there. The signpost I mentioned before, this logo is the one that was designed by Marcello Nizzoli, the designer, also the designer of the Lettera 22, and other typewriters and other, he was a sort of in-house designer for Olivetti. Very interesting to find in the archive. Actually, I found this, long before I saw the actual sign. Drawing showing this thing, which is essentially like a sandwich, not a sandwich, it's like a greeting card structure made of concrete, opened out, matching exactly the angle of the site. And there's another one down at this end of the site. In addition, the campus had a water tower. So you can see here the drawings for that, and the thermoelectric center. And these were they were designed quite differently from the factory itself, as if these were sort of permanent, as opposed to like, not sort of transitory, but this was the fixed part of the factory as opposed to the extendable part. So the building was based on a constructive system, and in this regard, it resembled the factory at Palermo that I showed briefly before. So you just briefly, it's instructive to compare them in order to understand what you're seeing here. So this is an overview of the Buenos Aires factory. So here's the section. So you have columns, beams. Here's the beam and plan, and a photograph of the beam, sort of after it was cast, sitting on the column, the perspective of the end of the building. So in this respect, it was very much like the design had followed the Palermo design. You had the canopy that goes over the top of the building. You had the skylights that, the canopy stopped short, or actually, hover, like extended over the glass pane to shelter it, but stopped short of the whole end of the joist, so that light could be let in. At Palermo, it looked like this. Here in Buenos Aires, it looked like this, skylights. The joists, a rather flat joist versus a more of a pitched type shape. It's just a slab of concrete, cast concrete, sitting on the beam. So the joist sat on the beam. Beam had this shape to accommodate the joist on the top. Here's the joist and the beam. Palermo. So you have this system: canopy, skylight, joist, beam, column, and of course the slab. At Palermo, there was a sort of outer wall. You see here, not in Olivetti, but here in Buenos Aires, the outer wall would be a panel in between columns rather than sitting outside it, at least in the second version. Just details of that. And photographs of the structure. You can see the joists, they look quite thin. Skylights, beam, column, and the infill panel that makes the window. So there are some interesting comments that were made about the building. Roberto Guiducci, who was a kind of intellectual figure, also director of the Olivetti Technical Office. I won't read this whole quote here, but just to summarize, what he named this, he dubbed it architecture a posteriori, which means Zanuso had met with technicians and he had listened to what the brief was. He sort of absorbed a lot of details about what was needed from different points of view, and produced this solution that answered to them all, right? So as Guiducci describes it, he's keeping in view without setting aside all of the other secondary components, even the marginal ones. Instead of approaching the project with a preset scheme, of course, we've just seen he had a general approach, but not a kind of form, a fixed form in mind, for example. So design a posteriori. Another perspective on the building, one that was quite ecstatic, was that of Rainer Banham, who said that the way that the ventilation system is displayed in the Olivetti factory, he wrote, seems to satisfy a deep intellectual and moral need, the need to be able to see the difference between the structure, which is supposed to be permanent, and the services, which are hoped to be transient, and to see that difference made expressive. The building is serviced and manifestly seen to be serviced. The fact of servicing is seen to be within the architect's control, even if what is seen is not in detail entirely of the architect's design. So he too notices that Zanuso didn't sort of put his signature form on everything, but allowed forms to come into the project, and somehow was able to control them without being completely in control of them. Now, something I didn't mention, but probably should have, is that this, well, I'll come back to this point also. What Banham is talking about is that these beams are actually hollow. And what you see here in the central photo is an air conditioning unit attached to the end of the beam. So the beam is used instead of, is used as a duct. The beam is both a beam and a duct. It's hollow, and the air is blown into it. And instead of having that outbuilding that would have had to be rebuilt, that was meant to blow air down the entire length of the building, you had, instead of having that one giant ventilator, you had many small ventilators, one at the end of each of these beams. And here they are in this photograph here. So Gillo Dorfles, the painter and critic and historian, wrote a monograph on Zanuso, collected images of Zanuso's televisions and sewing machines, and included a chapter on factories like this one, where he said essentially what you see in this building, and he's referring to this extensible part made out of the system, is a kind of industrial design of building parts. And so these are like many industrial design projects built in, that bundled together in this building. So I think all of these provide a rich point of departure. And yet I feel, for example, in Dorfles's case, this needs to be developed a little bit. But I also think it's important to be able to talk about this building as like the artwork of this architect, right? This was a time when architecture was still talked about as one of the arts, with painting and sculpture, and there was still a sort of emphasis on the visual experience of the architecture. So part of what I think needs to be done is to dig in a little bit to this, like, what is it that we're seeing and what is the effect on us of what we see? And also, what did Zanuso want this building to be? What was sensibility that he brought to it? Now, he often tended to write about his projects like how I solved the problem. That seems to have been his favorite theme in papers, in his essays and texts. And he did participate in conferences and talk about other topics like color, how should we use color, but very pragmatic in his ideas, except at the very beginning. There was some theory, which I'll come back to. So that leaves a kind of detective work to be done to try to think about what he might have had in mind, even if we could just make some broad generalizations. One theme that is commonly investigated in projects like this is the organic or organicism. So the idea that the industrial could be redeemed by kind of being figured as a kind of nature, or like the motif of the cell, which I think is much more effective when applied to the Brazil factory. I can't remember if I kept a slide of that, which looks more like an aggregation of cells because it has these curved roof. The module is a kind of curved roof. But when Zanuso wrote about Le Corbusier in 1953 and about Jean Prouvé, he was much more interested in actually what this looked like. So I would say in the inorganic, or in a sense, the beauty of the right structural profiles. So I think it's that sensibility that merits more consideration here. He wrote, among his very early theoretical pieces, a text on the module, co-authored with Paolo Cessa, another architect. This is 1946, so the very beginning when Milan is still being rebuilt, writing in Domus about the module in modulo, I quote, "Its fundamental concept is to produce in the industrial cycle a determinate number of elements in series from which construction will follow as the result of assembly, from which is born the necessity to discover a dimensional reference that can connect all the elements of construction in the system adherent to functional necessities that contemporaneously respects the continuity of surfaces and volumes. We call this reference module." So they're thinking about how to achieve industrialization in order to be able to mass produce everything, but to have it still be beautiful and desirable. But even though this building doesn't, let's say, express the module, it does have a kind of modularity built into it. Also, why do I say inorganic? The illustrations to Il Modulo include atoms, I guess that's a cell, rocks, the periodic table. Zanuso's class at the Politecnico was one of the first where all the students had to study chemistry and geology. And I should say that the Politecnico had, let's say, about 200 students when Zanuso was there, of which about 20 from year to year would vary, but about 20 were architects. The rest, all engineers. So that helps us understand his kind of ease of working with technical specialists. But yes, his interests in organic, and I don't think that is somehow a compromise. Organic being, let's say, Art Nouveau, like Van de Velde, or the Italian Neo-Liberty, or organic like Frank Lloyd Wright, this kind of systematic way of trying to avoid rigorous straight lines. Zanuso loved straight lines and hard edges and sort of wanted to go deeper into that, but then to discover in there a kind of beauty. And that resonates with concrete art and much of what was going on, let's say, in the art world in different factions around that time. So I'm showing this image of the Triennale of 1951, so right around the time Zanuso, let's say 5 years after Zanuso wrote Il Modulo, a couple of years after his lady chair and the associated couch went into production, so he's already making these mass-produced furniture pieces. Here it is on display in the Triennale in the Palazzo d'Arte. The artists at the same time were intervening in spatial interventions. One of the Triennales would have like a wonderful neon sculpture in the stairwell by Lucio Fontana. But you see, they were doing these kind of the artists were doing these sort of spatial things. And Zanuso actually, around the same time, wrote an essay called Architecture and Painting, where he talked about how architecture, basically his theme was architects have kind of gravitated toward straight lines, simple planes, abstract forms, and so have painters. And that means that our work can feather together all the more easily and readily and effectively. So in a way, he was sort of advocating that architects practice this monochrome, but geometrically sort of coherent, effective, impactful architecture, and that artists be able to join and intervene. This is a project that Zanuso did around that time for a showroom for the linoleum, Società del Linoleum. It was a distributor of rubber surface finishes and so forth. And he collaborated with two artists. He designed the space, it's an interior, it's shop interior, so not the whole building, but the interior. He gave it a mezzanine. He worked on this stair. It's like a folded metal stair that curves. And he worked with two artists, Mario Balocco and Gianni Dova. And the artists did these kind of graphics on the surfaces in the product. So there were no like shelves of products here. The products were on display in the floor and in the walls. But what I find interesting here is not just this integration of the surface with the space, and here's another appearance of Zanuso's sofa, and Zanuso designed this table. But there's this kind of interlocking effect of the two-dimensional and the three-dimensional, this curve and this curve. And even when the project was published in Edilizia Moderna, Alva Steiner, who had also collaborated on the vitrine here, did the layout. And so you see he even starts to play his own game. So this is the part of the magazine, this is the wall pattern, and yet they're able to create this interlocking sort of multi-layered work. And I think this is important to understand the sensibility Zanuso would bring to industrial projects as well. Here is his apartment building on the Viale Gorizia in Milan, still there, it's a little muted now. It was never black and white, it was kind of tan with mustard, and it's 1950s colors. Tan, mustard, brown, and like burgundy. Stripes braid their way across the facade of this kind of mural. And this was a proposal Zanuso had made with another artist in the 1940s. So he was at that time really intensely involved in experiments with integrating different kinds of works together. This actually is standard railing from the canal edge in Milan nearby that they appropriated for balcony, for the balcony. Okay, I'm in the home stretch here. So the concept that I want to, that I'm working on and sort of trying to work out as a way of dealing with the Argentina factory is automatisms. And this comes from the philosopher Stanley Cavell, he wrote about the medium of film. And so I'm going to talk about three types of automatism that Cavell writes about. He said film gives us the experience of a reality that we're not actually part of, like a whole world in which our own desires are not in the picture. So we can enjoy film because we have nothing at stake. When we watch, Buster Keaton or, any kind of Nani Moretti film, or watch a movie, we're not in it. We're watching passively, in a sense. And that's part of the pleasure of film. What film does for us automatically is part of why we like it. And then there is sort of automation within film, how you have photography and the 24 frames per second that give you movement. So in a number of levels, film is it's automated, and our enjoyment of it is an appreciation of that automation. He talks about, in a way, medium. In a way, he's talking about the medium of film. He chooses automatism to be a bit more specific about this type of pleasure. But when he talks about modernism in these terms, he says essentially we can just understand modernism as artists becoming dissatisfied with the automatisms of their practice. So painters that no longer want to do figural painting, but want to do abstract or cubist painting, for example. And so they produce new automatisms. I told you I would make this mistake of my own concept. So a new genre of film, a type of modernism is a new genre of a medium. And so I want to think about Zanuso, and this is something I'm still developing, but wanted to put out there. I'd love to hear your thoughts on how good a job I am doing at this. That there is a sense in which Zanuso is, on the one hand, we can describe this project in terms of his relationship to the defaults and the givens and the constraints that are inbuilt in the factory project. So the a posteriori character means he's accepted the constraints on some sense, on some level. And then, obviously, this is reproducing reality. It's producing the reality of the Olivetti factory. It made that real in Buenos Aires. And I can say that seeing the billboard with that Olivetti logo, it felt very real to me as well. So it is architecture is perhaps, I feel I'm putting on myself the burden of giving an account of architecture as automatism. So it automatically produces a reality. We see it, it looks real. Sometimes it's not real. Some people said the Olivetti project, corporate project, was just doomed, but it was real for a short time. And this architecture was its scenography, and it's the place where it existed. So it reproduces or produces a reality for us that we can enter into, we can walk through it. And serial production is, in a sense, a kind of automation. Then there is the relationship that Zanuso had to the needs of the project. So that's where I want to go in this last little part. These are renderings of that first version that I showed here with the long duct and the big fan building. Here's a version of that big fan. It looks kind of expressionist in this one, but and you see the beam in this case. It had a cantilever. It sat on a column. It cantilevered out, and then there was a wall below it. So these windows, which are unbroken, are kind of existing within the zone between this freestanding wall below and the cantilevered canopy above. So there's a certain ambition, a tectonic ambition, to quote one of my professors, even in this early scheme, although I think the expression is a bit much. So to contrast the two, what's different here is that the kind of opening for the duct has found a home in the beam. It's gone from this kind of beam to this one. And there are a number of traits that this project had that in which you can see these kind of details from engineering that have been incorporated here. There's a flange, the tube, of course, structural tube, and there's the duct. So these are all sort of objects that have come from outside, let's say, architecture in the sense of form making and space making. And yet Zanuso somehow is able to make them seem to fit within the architectural whole. the machine that blows the air, another inclusion, one could call it. And there are ways of drawing that Zanuso had to do in order to, communicate with the engineer, to communicate with the construction team. This is alignment of centers is native to mechanical engineering. And you can see even in the architectural drawing, I'm not sure what this is, probably an engineering drawing. This is definitely an architecture drawing. And even here, they've sort of laid down the beam, turned it sideways, created this way of drawing the beam so you can see the section and you can see the sort of under the underside and the section of the beam in the same drawing and the plan. So they're starting to draw the building the way you might draw a car or another object. There's also a certain use of symmetry and axiality in the building. So this is a one unit. It's a long tube, machine at one end, duct-like openings along the sides, but also this like final opening in the middle, column, column, column. And these are lined up to make the building. So constructing a bay is to construct two of these. It's double loaded, let's say, across an axial center line there. That's the production area. Assembly and packaging has its own sort of central axis. Social services wing. It's all governed quite by symmetry. So this is essentially where I'm at, to say that Zanuso was able to produce the design that we know by, in part, absorbing the kind of automatisms or the defaults and necessity of other disciplines into his designs. And part of how he did this was to draw on traditional architecture, symmetry, axiality, in order to make these a coherency in the building, even with when it had these inclusions that came from outside. And that is where the kind of formal language of this particular building emerges from, and it remains rooted in the industrial setting. This is where it originated, this is where the forms came from, and this characterizes the building that he made. And this, I think, just even as some other of Zanuso's projects look a little different and may not foreground this particular issue quite so much as this factory does. So I think that's part of why the Buenos Aires factory is so distinctive. Here, just three parting examples: the Palermo factory again, the Buenos Aires factory. These machines have been taken off. It's been quite modified. These have been filled in with the soffit, but this is what the original design was. And this is the factory that Zanuso designed after Buenos Aires, another variation, this one, with the ducts on the roof, but similarly trabeated architectural system. Thank you so much for your attention.
Gracias, Shantel, for your presentation, your very detailed presentation. We have some time for comments or questions. I don't know if anyone has one. I had two comments or two questions. The first one was, what were your thoughts on I think that I didn't know the first version of the factory with the centralized ventilation machinery or architectural piece. And I found it quite interesting that the project went to having one centralized facility to a lot of individual pieces that were, part of the system, like a way of disarming a technical element. And what were your thoughts on that? then I was wondering what was the talk was very focused on Zanuso, on the factory and the reception, and what Banhan said, and so on. But what was the state of the art for this architectural problem in other factories, in other architectures? Was it good to put a ventilator inside a beam and do a duct inside a construction system? What were your thoughts on that as well?
Those are good questions. I think the first one, I think the insight is just that by making the ventilation sort of serially producible, part of it is that they had developed this kind of cybernetic technology for managing and coordinating the ventilators. So one thing they were able to do was adjust the temperature in a certain part of the building by, firing up those ventilators over there a bit more, while keeping another part, maybe needed more cooling or something like that. So I've read that was considered to be like a kind of achievement and advantage, but also I think just to be able to, when expanding, just be able to calculate exactly what you will need. But we just need 4 more bays and 4 more ventilators, for example. I think it's just operationally effective. I don't know much about, let's say, factories around the world. I think a kind of reference here is Robert Maillard, like his railway canopy at Chiasso, which maybe in structures class, many people still are learning about. And of course, not so much Nervi, who seems to be kind of an outlier, which is kind of a pity. But like Mattei Trucco, who designed the Lingotto factory at Turin for the Fiat factory with the test track on the roof. I think uses of concrete like that were in vogue. Concrete must have been an economical material. It would become pretty common in Italy. You see warehouses that are kind of like, they look sort of like maybe bargain basement versions of some of these single-story structures. And then there were other architects too, like Angelo Mangiarotti in Italy, who really got into this particular typology and produced a number of factories that are variations on a theme of the trebiated structure. In the bigger European context, it would be interesting to see, like, for example, there were military infrastructures in Estonia and in Germany, I guess, as well, that may have used similar technologies, and probably even France, like Freycinet, the air hangers from the late 19th century would be part of this bigger history of sort of concrete serial structure.
Thank you. I don't know if anyone has another comment.
First of all, thank you for your talk. And I guess I kept thinking about this moment where you said you saw it yesterday or a couple of days ago, and I think it's this thing you've been seeing along so many years that you finally saw it now, and how it's like now. And I wonder if this automatism, like this new reality that you saw about the building, how it changed your perception about it from being all this that you just explained to maybe just a logo behind an old billboard. And secondly, in like a broader picture, how should we look at all this constructive mass from already 10 years? Latin America is a very great example because we have a lot of industries and offices
Yeah, I mean, both good questions. And I think you could even go further to say, and something I think about a lot, as to your second question about like the mass. I mean, David Harvey said a few years ago that like the amount of concrete that has been poured in China in the last, 20 years is more than the entire history of concrete. So it's hard not to look at this project now from, what we know about the environment and the land. All I can say is that at the time, it was still the kind of romantic notion of the hinterland, the new world, and this blank slate where there were seemingly endless resources, and we just had to take advantage of them. Unfortunately, that attitude was still standard even. But then if you look at the population and the extent of the city, when that was built at Merlo, there was nothing around it. Like you see pictures and it's just like desert. So you can understand how they must have felt that they were on a frontier. As to reuse, it's actually, I think, even though it's quite a different building as a cigarette factory, they've filled in some of the overhangs with soffits. They've cleaned it up quite nice. It seems to work very well as a cigarette factory, as far as I can tell. And so you could say it's been reused. I can't say that's true of all of Zanuso's projects like this. Some of them are ruins. Like there's one at Pavia in Italy that's like acres and acres of just rust and crumbling concrete. But this one has been reused. I think it's been modified to the point that I don't know whether we could get landmark status for it anymore. But it does seem to be quite adaptable. Also at Guarulhos in Brazil, the Brazil factory was turned into a shopping mall. It had columns that were sources of ventilation rather than beams, and they've just been covered up. And meanwhile, the roof has kept its shape in many places. So it seems to be, these have seemed to have lent themselves pretty well to reuse. But maybe that depends in part on where they are. And the first question you asked is very interesting as well. The concrete isn't this sort of smooth, abstract. If you look at it just in pictures, you could get the idea that the concrete is this like smooth abstraction, just kind of idealized plane. But if you look closely, you can see the seams where the boards of the formwork were. And around the entrance canopy, you can see a kind of a bubbling where the concrete oozed around the formwork. And it's still there. So it was a handmade object in the end, a specific, site-specific object in the end. And it was very well loved as it was. It didn't need to be ideal. And yes, I think part of what's really fascinating seeing buildings in person is to discover details like that what's represented and talked about and dreamed about as something pristine and pure was actually rough and uneven. I think they did a very good job, but you can see artifacts all over the building, and I think that's quite beautiful. I think the tension there is quite compelling. So I think I see that as a tension, but not a contradiction, let's say. So even though I've been thinking about, it's still true that they were very systematic about how they built it. No less true. But it is not a picture of the automatic. It's not a picture of automation in the sense that certain structures might be more. Let's see. well, like the Pompidou Center building in Paris. It's made of, you can see the steel, all the steel structure and the circulations on the outside. I'd say that the sort of high tech tried to make a spectacle out of the seriality and sort of automatism in the building in a way that this building didn't quite so dramatically. But that I think that's another question I should think more about when writing about it, like the level of the spectacle. I think it might have been, was it meant to be subtle? Was it meant to be just a productive space that nobody thought twice about what it looked like? Yeah, I think that needs some more work. So thank you.
I wanted to ask you about this that you're mentioning about the Pompidou. I was thinking of another examples and also taking you outside of your comfort zone of a historian and of someone who's actively engaged in architectural discourse. All these days we haven't just talked about history, we talked about contemporary architecture, we talked about architecture from other centuries, so you know a lot of what's going on in the discipline and what has been going on in the last 20 years. And I was wondering about this, something that surprised me of all these images that you've shown is the level of expressionism the structural design had. So like the level of detail and the angle and the shapes, it didn't look well. Aside from that, what is fascinating is this idea of, is there an aestheticization of the thermomechanics of the building? Okay, designing a structure as an architectural problem, okay, and we can see the shape of a column, the shape of a bridge, you were speaking about that before, but plumbing, air conditioning, and so on, that's something that appears in that decade and in the decade afterwards, and it was something discussed, and it was an argument of the time, and some people like me said, okay, plumbing, thermomechanics, and so on, that's not a problem of architecture. Architecture is structure, roof, sidings, and so on. And that's a problem that comes and goes in a way in architecture. We're seeing it again, right? We're seeing again buildings that try to have this revival of the Pompidou effect, not just trying to show the bones of the structure, but also show the organ of the building. And at the same time, when we went to see the building, it was strange because that part, the fascinating part that made the beam hollow, it's the part that doesn't work anymore. So it's the moment when architecture wants to catch up on technology, but sometimes it's difficult to catch up because, I don't know, air conditioning units change and there's it's not part of our discipline. But I wanted to ask you a little bit about this, about what you thought of that topic and how it kind of comes and goes in architectural discourse.
That's interesting. Well, Rainer Banham pointed out, and this was a type of structure that Banham talked about as having an advantage that because the machine's on the outside, if they upgraded it, you just take it off and you put another one on. But I think that this question of like how we want to see or not see the mechanism of thermoregulation is an interesting one with respect to this building because they've capped the beam ends and they've taken these things down. I feel like I've seen, even on Google Maps a few years ago, they still had one there, but they're gone now. But on the roof, they've got all this like
new pipes,
new like big metal ducts that you can just see. They're just and also some ventilating machines just randomly on the roof. So maybe they think they're invisible Maybe they don't see them somehow. But I think maybe it's a question of deciding, okay, we don't want it on the front of the building, but we'll tolerate it on the top of the building. I don't know. Let's see, I'm just trying to get back to one of those. Are pictures of the original. There. So here you can see.
Yeah, that was another. But I think you have better pictures.
There, yeah, the caps of the beams, capped beam, and you can see the canopy that still extends out, even though there's no machine there. Here you can see. They're willing to put up with this. You can see them on the top, and in the aerial view, you can see them studying the top. So yeah, I mean, in a way, maybe it's the retreat of boldness in showing the machine. At the same time, a kind of laziness about like, oh well, or maybe a new default that is not so desirable, where they are willing to put up with the sight of them on the top of the roof. You know, in Houston we have a building at the Menil Collection by Johnson Mark Lee. It's the Drawing Institute, and it has a courtyard, kind of like an Italian domus, like this ringed. It's a shed roof in a way that slopes down toward the center from four sides. And it's flat. It looks like it's flat. The architects conceived it as this pristine sort of set of planes. And they're unhappy with how it, according to the engineer, they're not so happy with how it came out because since those metal panels are sandwich boards, like kind of like corrugated cardboard with two sheets of metal and then these struts between the two sheets, the metal has started to sag between the struts. So when you look at the underside, it's wavy. And apparently the architects they're not happy with that. So the sort of assertion of gravity and the real, architects remain ambivalent toward that.
I don't know if there's any other comments. If not, thank you so much, Shantel, for your presentation.
Thanks again.